readers of the line, people whom we love and adore very much. So we are going to try and start this new feature here at the line, where it is discussions about the Dispatch. For those of you who are longtime fans, you very well know that we have a Friday, sometimes Saturday morning Dispatch. People who are cult fanatics of the line are really into our Dispatch, so we thought, wouldn't it be fun to provide a kind of video conversation about what goes into creating the Dispatch? So the Dispatch is mostly written by Matt and myself. Occasionally we have some of our other colleagues jump in, so when it's appropriate, they might join us on this video, but we're just trying to give you a little bit of insight into what our thought process is before we actually write the damn thing.
The fun thing is too, Jen, we have already told people, and here I'm taking notes as we're writing because I'm a professional. We've already told people that the Dispatch is going to be moving behind our paywall. That's coming up in a couple of weeks, and these videos will not. So probably, you know what, I would paywall these if we could, but for technical reasons we actually can't, which is boring. But once these things exist on YouTube, anyone can forward the link out to anyone else, and it's not worth the hassle for us to figure out a way to actually paywall that. So these will be publicly available, and yeah, as Jen said, these will give us kind of a sense of what will be included in the Dispatch and how we got to that conclusion. Let's start actually, Jen, by mentioning what will not be in the Dispatch this week, at least in any meaningful way. On my notes, I have written down leftovers. And what I mean by that is that we are not planning in any meaningful way about talking about the federal election or Afghanistan in the Dispatch, because we've covered that lots in columns this week, also including some that at this point haven't even published yet. By the time anyone sees this video, they'll be live, but we haven't even published them yet. There's not going to be much left for us to say, so we're not going to bother. The exception will be if something comes up between basically when the columns go live and when the Dispatch goes live. If there are any major developments, we'll mention them, but other than that, no, we're looking at other stuff, including, this is one just from the world of journalism. You and I both noted this and both wrote this down. The Toronto Star has made a series of hires this week, which is interesting for two reasons. First of all, it's rare to see a Canadian newspaper with enough money to make hires by the batch these days. That was good. I hope that suggests the new owners of the Star are willing to invest a little bit. And the other thing, Jen, that you and I both noted right away is that the hires they made are actually really good hires.
Totally solid. I mean, all of these people are well known in the industry. They're basically some of the best in the business. There's not a mark on any of them. And also what's interesting to me is that, you know, in the last couple of years, we've seen the Toronto Star kind of start to go down the social justice rabbit hole a little bit. They're starting to get in some corners tiny bit over the top and loopy, which to some extent is fine, because that fits within the Toronto Star's mandate. It's got the Atkinson principles. They've always been, you know, heavy on sort of leftist, more progressive politics, so that's great. But it's also going to be really good to make sure that that impulse, that really positive impulse, is grounded in just solid, thoughtful, intelligent, salt of the earth kind of journalism standards and ethics. And all of these people are stellar for that. So to me, it's a really good indication that, you know, the adults are in the room in the Toronto Star, and I think that's good.
You know, it's funny because early in the line's existence, you in particular had written about some of the newsroom meltdowns we'd seen across the North American media landscape. At the time, I tapped out of writing about those because I still had some proximity to some of those issues myself. And I just said to you, I'm going to feel like I'm subtweeting my colleagues if I write these things, especially if I write them blind. So you basically ran with them, which was...
Which is a benefit, because I've been out of an actual newsroom for so long now that like nobody cares what I think anymore.
I think people care, but I just think it's interesting because one of the challenges that we had noted is that, you had noted, but I agreed with, is that newspapers, as they get smaller, they get flatter. And that's okay in some ways. Like I have no objection to democratizing a newsroom, except of course it's still, like, as romantic as we can sometimes get about the news industry, it's still a business, and it's an office environment, and there are managers, and these things have to flow through chains of command in order to be effective. And I think, I mean, from what I know of these new Star hires, these are really smart, credible, experienced people. Journalism is also getting younger because older journalists are taking packages. Yeah,
fleeing.
Yeah, or they're hanging on. They're taking their packages. They're getting out. there's something of a missing middle generation of journalists, people kind of maybe in their 40s or 50s who took packages early. So you've got some remaining olds, and God knows I love them. Like they're the backbone of a lot of these newsrooms. We also got a lot of really, really young journalists. I think one of the missing spots is sort of mid-career guys who are still have some longevity, but are not pretty raw. So these star hires seem to fit that missing middle really well. You and I both know the editor-in-chief of the Star, and when I saw these hires, I thought, Ammo, well done. Like this was really good decision making. So we'll talk about that a bit. You mentioned one. This is fun. Premiers missing in action.
Yeah, so this is also really so it's been noted that kind of Doug Ford is and all of his people have are gone and or have effectively been told don't touch the federal election, don't screw it up, don't blow on it. Like, you know what I mean? Like everything's coming together like with duct tape and glue, and like any kind of movement is going to cause a fracture. Also, Kenny completely AWOL, completely gone on vacation. We're seeing COVID numbers rise in Alberta again, and basically nobody's really getting involved or responding to it. I think this is interesting. It does seem to me a reflection of just sort of the overall disciplined nature of the Conservative campaign. The premiers have conveniently decided to duck out and not make themselves the issue. Mm-hmm. And also, I think they've preempted a very obvious Liberal attack. They're saying, look, we are not going to allow our unpopularity with our own populations to undermine O'Toole's chances, because I mean we know that Kenny and Ford would have been just obvious balloon-sized targets for Trudeau to hit in this election campaign. So it's just kind of interesting to note that they're gone and trying to get into the logic of why they're gone.
Yeah, I mean, there had been an expectation before the writ actually dropped and Afghanistan collapsed at the exact same time that one of the early things we'd see in the campaign is Justin Trudeau openly campaigning against Jason Kenney and Doug Ford.
And we saw early signs of that with Hadji. Hadji was basically taking shots at Dina Hinshaw here in Alberta.
So what we've seen since, and this is something reported, I'm in Toronto, you're in Calgary. I don't know if you even saw this, but the Toronto Star reported a few weeks ago that there's a ceasefire between the federal Liberal campaign and the Doug Ford Conservatives. And basically the Liberals don't want to get into a fight because the Ontario Conservatives, they got problems right now, but they also have a very large pool of mobilizable volunteers for the ground war. They could get people put out signs, knocking on doors. I don't think the Liberals want to be messing with that, and I think the Liberal part of the bargain is that we don't want to face that. And for Doug Ford, he's taken a beating. He's down in the polls. His government's battered. He doesn't want to have pot shots being taken at him all throughout the campaign. And what is interesting, I think, is that there have been a few opportunities when the Prime Minister has taken a shot at Doug Ford, and the response from the Ontario Conservatives has been, well, that's okay.
Which is really smart. The more that the Conservatives can just not fall into these, I mean, both provincially and federally, the more the Conservatives can just not fall into these obvious traps, the better off they're going to be. Just curious.
Well, the reporting always was that Doug Ford was very angry at being marginalized in the 2019 campaign, and that both provincial and federal Conservatives concluded afterward that maybe you don't want Doug Ford at the center of your Ontario effort, but that they could have used the other parts of the party's infrastructure. And as recently as Thursday this week, it was reported again that Premier Ford has said, I don't want my people campaigning. I don't want them helping. So the Liberals have bent the ceasefire a few times, but the Conservatives in Ontario have chosen not to fire back. Let's talk something else in Ontario, something else that you had flagged. I wrote about it a bit this week for TVO, which is where I write some columns. Dr. David Fisman is a fairly high-profile doctor here. He's been one of the public faces of information during the pandemic, and he's been very critical of the Ford government, which is fine. I have too. Ford has deserved it. There was an interesting incident earlier this week, though. Jen, I'll describe it, and then you can kind of give your reaction to it. Okay. In Ontario, at the very beginning of the pandemic, a group of medical experts, doctors, epidemiologists, infectious disease guys, data experts, and modelers came together and all agreed to volunteer their services to the Ontario government. It's kind of horrifying that the Ontario government didn't have this kind of talent in-house. but it just didn't exist. So basically, on a volunteer basis, dozens of really smart brains and experts came together and said, we will provide, I think it's the Ontario COVID-19 Scientific Round Task Force, or I don't remember what it's called, the Science Table.
The Science Table, yeah.
Science Table, and they will advise the government with modeling and information. And Dr. Fisman has been a member of the table, but he's also been an outspoken critic of the government. He resigned this week and got a lot of support. People saying, "Hey, way to go! Appreciate the language you've used to stand up to Doug Ford, stuff like that." But the thing is, Dr. Fisman had made a claim a couple of weeks ago on Twitter that there was modeling that showed a bad fall coming for Ontario, that the COVID-19 case counts were going to be high enough that even with a high vaccination rate, we could be in deep trouble again in the fall. This was a very specific claim by Dr. Fisman. There is modeling and it is not being publicized. I and a bunch of others reached out to our contacts on the Ontario Science Table. There is no such model.
Yeah, they publicly stated that there was
so they have publicly stated it, but then also guys like me were kind of poking people, kind of going, well, is there something that could be reasonably close? Like, could this be a misunderstanding of some kind? And the word I'm getting from multiple sources on the Science Table is that we don't know what Dr. Fisman is talking about. So he's made this he's resigned now. Okay, it's a volunteer position. If he wants to resign, I'm not going to criticize him for that. And to be clear, I agree with a lot of what Fisman has said during this pandemic. He has been right many times and the government has been wrong. But first of all, I don't know what he's talking about when he quits. Also, when you quit on a point of principle, you are saying something inevitably about the principles of those who have not quit. There's no way around that. Fisman's resignation is a tacit criticism of those remaining members of the volunteer science table.
Well, okay, so a couple points. One is that as much as Fisman's gotten things right, I would note that there are a couple of key crucial things that the science table's gotten wrong. Notably, some of their modeling earlier in the campaign, and like we flagged that, and so did Colby Kosh at the Post. So like, I'm all for modeling. However, I do think that when you make predictive models that are short of the mark, you need to come forward and say, hey, we got this wrong, and this is how and why we got this wrong. I mean, I'll take my own lumps here. A couple back in May, I said, like, I don't think that Alberta's going to have I was careful. I did add some caveats here, but I did say, look, I don't think that Alberta is going to have a fourth wave. Look at what's happening in the UK. It seems to be okay. And then a fourth wave came. So, I mean, I wrote a caller or a dispatch a few weeks ago. It was like, hey, I got that wrong. Here's what I got wrong. Here's what I got right. That's just part of the situation. Nothing is totally knowable. But one thing that I find very frustrating about the epidemiologists, the Twitter squad of epidemiologists and doctors who are constantly raising alarms about COVID, is that they're perfectly happy to crow when they're right, but they don't take their lumps when they're wrong. And I think that for me is an ongoing source of annoyance and frustration. I don't think most reasonable people are that far off on COVID. Like, I don't think there's actually among the sane middle, there's a huge divide among the situation of it and how we should be handling it, to be honest with you. But there's a couple things that I noted with Fisman. The first is that he used to put on his Twitter something to the effect of, when we get to a 70% vaccination rate, I'm going to delete my Twitter account. That seems to have disappeared. Secondly, I do think that people are conflating their frustration and their anger at people like Doug Ford and Jason Kenney with their risk assessment of COVID overall. I think that there's a huge conflation of those two issues. I think that a lot of these premiers have so lost credibility with the public that nobody is now in a position to say, hey, I think maybe things are getting better and it's going to be okay. Mm-hmm. That now gets wrapped up into a sort of a broader partisan conversation that is just detached from the reality on the ground. And secondly, I think that's what's interesting to note is, like, I think it takes some hot stones to bail out on the science table and implicitly condemn all of the ethics of the people behind you when you are somebody who has been criticized for taking money from the teachers unions and not appropriately disclosing that yourself, as Fisman has. And secondly, the last thing I would note is that he seems to be putting out these kind of independent models that are terrifying. They show like exponential growth, like literally off the charts exponential growth. But again, not showing the work as to what his thinking is going into that, not showing really the math behind it, and also caging it in these kind of hedgy types of tweets that say something, well, I don't actually expect this to happen, but this could happen. And like, well, if you don't actually expect this to happen, then what is the value add of releasing a chart like that that's only going to scare the shit out of people? Like, I actually think that there's a bit of an attention economy problem happening here, and where people who are criticizing the governments that they hate most strongly are wrapping that up in sort of incredibly fear-mongery type language about COVID, because it's all connected now. And also, if you're going to put out alternative models to what the science table is putting out, good, do it. I totally applaud that. Put that out for all to see, and then we'll see and come back in 6 weeks and see how accurate you were. But if you're going to put out those types of statements, don't buttress them with unfalsifiable kind of caveats, so that you can always claim that you were right. I mean, I don't think that 18 months into a pandemic, it's responsible to still be scaring the shit out of people who are already scared. Like that I think is really questionable.
You and I have talked a bit about this. One of the things I think that first of all, I'll say I'm impressed. You're paying a lot more attention to Fisman's Twitter account than I am, because half that stuff went right over my head. I think there is a very different context for how Ontarians view all this versus how the rest of the country might view this, for one big reason. First of all, I am going to agree with the point you made, and I've made this point myself separately. I think a lot of us, probably to our overall misfortune, took COVID-19 and didn't understand it correctly. We should have viewed this as a once in a lifetime, we hope, rare event, and treated it as such. What we've more often done as individuals, but I also think kind of as institutions or as ideological tribes, is we took COVID-19 and we folded it into our pre-existing political and cultural views, which was, instead of going, well, here's a virus that will kill a few young people, some middle-aged people, and a whole heap of old people, we basically went, well, you know what? If the libs are telling me to mask up, I'm not going to do it because they're woke. Or, we've had stupid reactions to it that way. And I think some of us have Fisman's COVID tweets and Fisman's political tweets were sometimes hard to tell apart. Yeah. And so that's, to be honest, I actually started paying a lot less attention to his account a few months ago, because I thought something maybe was going on there. So that's probably why you know a lot more about the stuff than I do. The other thing I would say, though, is why Ontario views this differently is that the third wave was an unmitigated clusterfuck that never had to happen. There was no reason for us to have a third wave, because Ontario began a reopening after the second wave when things had already turned around. Like it wasn't like we were like, all right, we're going to begin the reopening as things were dropping. Like, we were coming up. And I remember my colleague, John Michael McGrath at TVO, you've probably seen the clip. In the middle of a press conference, is like, well, based on what I'm seeing right now, you're forecasting a disaster. Like, am I wrong? And the science table guys, like the provincial ones, not the volunteer ones, like, no, you're not wrong. Like, the third wave was mishandled so badly by the Ontario government, not only in the lead up to it, but then also as it really hit. Like, we authorized huge sweeping police powers for the police forces that blew up in Doug Ford's face. We closed playgrounds for some reason. I think, in terms of the politics of this, on the one hand, I think we need to separate our understanding of the pandemic from our political preferences. On the other hand, I will never again have faith in the Doug Ford government, because they mangled it so badly that I should know better than this. Trained professional who's used to balancing all these competing bits of info. I don't know if the rest of the country understands how radicalizing the mishandling of the third wave was.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point. I mean, I don't want to fall into the mook trap of like defending Doug Ford, because I'm not interested in doing that. But what I do think is interesting is, or that you always have to consider in all of this, is that it's impossible to prove the counterfactual here. If things had been better handled, how much better would that third wave had been?
I don't know.
This is hard to say. And also, this is also where I think Alberta presents an interesting contrast to some of these situations, because Alberta's remained overwhelmingly more open than Ontario throughout all of this. The political culture is different. We've had the same sort of screaming progressives on the left saying, close down, close down, close down. And the government resisted those efforts considerably more. I mean, my child never left school last year. School was not closed down.
My son has never had a normal year of school.
Well, yeah, exactly. So, I mean, the experiences have been very different. And yet, look at the actual lines on the graph, man. Like, Alberta's waves were how should I say this? They were spikier. So they
Mhm.
were at their worst, they were worse per capita,
Then
but
they
they
came
also
right down.
dropped, but they came right down a lot faster. So is it possible that the easing of the restrictions in a different way, in a different tone, sort of compressed the spread in a different way? I mean, what was Alberta's capacity versus Ontario's? I mean, I know in Alberta, for example, we had plans at one point to create 750 emergency ICU beds, which were never enacted.
Yeah,
So like our healthcare system kind of got close to capacity, but healthcare system never collapsed.
I think,
So
yeah, what you're saying is fair, but I think it's also, I think you're, yes, but no, because first of all, yes, but here's the no part. It wasn't the outcome, it was the process. It
there you go.
was
Yes, yes,
like in
yes.
Ontario, it wasn't that the third wave crushed us. And I'd have to confirm this. I think it actually by deaths, it was our least deadly wave because we did have some vaccination done, including our long-term care homes. But it was, it's fine. It's fine. Don't worry. We're going to keep reopening. Haircuts next week. And meanwhile, me and 15 million of my buddies are looking at the charts and they're going, they're coming up again. And the
Yeah,
government's like, everything's great. Don't worry about it. Ah, holy shit. The police have just stoppo powers and get
right.
everyone off the
Yeah, I get that.
playground. Like
Yeah,
it wasn't the outcome of the wave. It was the obvious panic and mishandling at the political level. And there's something I actually wrote about. I wrote a column specifically about this like a few days before we brought the hammer down and said, hey, police powers, you can stop anyone arbitrarily and basically say papers please. Just a few days before that, we were telling patios to reopen. So what
yeah.
ended up happening is that all these poor guys, like the patio owners, they were tapping new kegs of beer. They were stocking up the fridge with vegetables and fresh food, and all that stuff got like huge expense that got wasted because the government went from full speed ahead to full reverse in days. So I think that's what damaged him. It wasn't how many people died or got sick. It was the fact that they obviously didn't know what they were doing and panicked. All right, that's enough about that. We got to
Yeah,
wrap this.
that distinction I think is worth coming back to after the election because I think that's I didn't understand that and I get it now. I get it now after talking to you. Okay,
The only other item on our list was
off the record.
yeah, off the record stuff. Mercedes Stevenson of Global News, who is a reporter, but also specifically with interest in military matters. She's one of the best in the country. Tweeted out on Wednesday night from the Liberal campaign plan, we were just invited to a private conversation off the record with the Liberal leader, Mr. Trudeau. The Globe and Mail was as well, and we both declined. We will not do off the record conversations with leaders during the campaign period. Off the record conversations happen a lot. I've been talking to all the campaigns. I've been talking to friends within every party this week, just saying, how are things going? What do you think of this? Just keeping the lines of communication open. It's different on a campaign plane with the guy who is a leader of a party and seeking to be continued as the prime minister.
Well, and also what's interesting about the off the record stuff and a couple things worth unpacking here is that in order to sort of collectively announce that you are not accepting an off the record chat, there's something self-serving and brand building about that. Like usually if you just project an off the record chat, you're just going to be like, no, I'm not going to accept an offer. Like you don't announce that on Twitter. Secondly, I don't think there's anything wrong with certain kinds of off the record chats. Like if you are, sorry, I'm getting crying babies in the background. Everything's fine though. Everything's fine. If you're talking about an off the record chat that's like, hey, we're just going to go have some beers with the prime minister and just chill out a bit, be human for a little while. That's the kind of off the record environment that I think is fine. But the fact that they rejected that and did so publicly would indicate to me that there are times when you would categorically not accept an off the record chat. And that is if you thought your source was going to use that convention to manipulate you.
Yeah.
So for example, if Justin Trudeau were saying, do you want an off the record chat on what's really happening in Afghanistan? Wink, wink.
Yeah.
The reason why he's doing that is that he's going to spin you some probably bullshit intel about how hard they're really working. And it's an attempt to manipulate you so that you go easier on him when he's on the record in front of a scrum. Like that's the only real reason to do that kind of an off the record chat in that kind of a scenario. So my suspicion is that Fife and Stevenson in very publicly saying nah fuck you was that they were communicating that there was some backyard spinning happening and that their colleagues were not making such a principled stand and so therefore were being spun and they were refusing to.
The tweets were to the entire free world. The message was aimed directly at the liberal campaign leadership. Don't ask us to do this again. And it is worth noting that both Mr. Fife and Ms. Stevenson have been writing about the Afghan effort. And about 12 hours after they announced that they had rejected an off-the-record invite,
New talking points.
well, the armed forces announced that the mission was over. So this is pure speculation on my part, pure 100%, and I want everyone to know that. My gut feeling is that they wanted to talk about the Afghan mission ending, and they wanted to do it off the record, and they wanted to get that message out so that
and they wanted to soften everybody up and prep them for that.
The fact that
there's just nothing more that we could possibly do.
Yeah.
Like, we're all out, and I don't think it's also a coincidence that now you're seeing sort of liberal affiliated and liberal sympathetic figures basically trying to spin this kind of line where it's just like, well, it was just impossible. Our situation was impossible, and we couldn't possibly do any more, right?
Well, that is the column I'm going off to right now, which by the time anyone sees this will be published. So that's the genesis of that column.
Okay, so how are we going to divide this up? Want me to do Fisman and off the record, and you do missing premiers, 4-star hires?
Yeah, and then I'll also put the leftover nuggets at the top if any new developments come.
Sure.
And yeah, okay, that's good. And I will let you go retrieve the child who is hopefully not fallen down a well.
Fine. No wells, we're fine.
Mine are off at a friend's house, so
just lock them up in a cardboard box. It was not a problem at all. Okay.
As long as you put a couple air holes in there, you're fine.
It's fine.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for watching this. We'll be doing more of these. I hope you enjoyed them, and I hope you enjoyed the dispatch, which by now you might have read already. Take care. We'll see you next week.